Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our SpedNet Wilson webinar. We are thrilled to have with us as our speaker tonight, attorney Ptahra Jeppe. I am Janine Kelly, co-president of SpedNet Wilson. Our moderators are co-president Carolina Corrigan and Eve Kessler, executive director of SpedNet Wilson. We're also very grateful for our co-sponsors, Southport CoLab and Literacy How, and we thank them for their partnership. So tonight, attorney Jeppe will be discussing building skills for college success. Attorney Jeppe is a Walensky Fellowship attorney with Disability Rights Advocates, the leading national nonprofit disability rights law center. She received her Juris Doctor magna cum laude with a curricular focus on disability law and policy, as well as a master's in education in disability studies from the Syracuse University College of Law. She received her BA magna cum laude with departmental honors from Adelphi University. Attorney Jeppe has extreme dyslexia, and her wisdom and insights are based on both personal and professional experience. For more information on Attorney Jeppe, you can visit our website at www.spednetwilton.org or our Facebook page. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recorded will be uploaded on our SpedNet Wilton website and also our Facebook page. So if you don't have the chance to watch it live, you can go back and watch us later. Just a few ground rules before we get started. We'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation, so please make sure that you type them into the Q&A. It's much easier to keep track of them when you type them there as opposed to the chat. The chat just disappears and we can't keep track of the questions. So type them into the Q&A and we'll do our best to answer the questions in the order they're received. Also, please be mindful that this is an open forum and it's also being recorded and it will be posted later. So we can't guarantee any confidentiality. So you may not want to reveal any private information that you don't want out in the public forum. Also, any information provided in this webinar by Attorney Jeppe or the moderators is not intended to be legal or therapeutic advice. The information, content, and materials that we present are for your general information only. And with that being said, I'll turn the mic over to Attorney Jeppe. Hello.
Thank you. Thank you for having me this evening. I'm going to share my screen so that we can see the PowerPoint that I put together. Okay, so here we go. As was mentioned, we're going to be talking this evening about building skills for college success. My name is Ptahra Jeppe. I'm going to dive right in. As mentioned, I am a disability civil rights attorney. I have a master's in education and disability studies, and I'm a person with a disability. I'm extremely dyslexic. I'm going to use myself tonight as an example. When going through some of the slides and talking about some of the skills that I have put together and think is critical for college success. A little bit about my background. I am from New York City. I have experienced almost every educational environment that the New York City Department of Education had to offer. So I was a special education student who started out in general ed. I had resource room, now called SETS. I experienced a 6-to-1 special ed classroom environment, 12 to 1-to-1, an ICT class. And from 7th to 12th grade, I graduated from a school for children with learning-based disabilities. I think that's really important in framing kind of my experience when navigating higher education. I went to Adelphi and participated in their learning disability program, and then also received supports and services in law school. And I also utilize accommodations in my professional life as an attorney. So let's get started. So the first skill that I think is really important when starting the college journey is thinking about and really understanding your learning strengths, weaknesses, and needs, and being able to describe them or articulate them. And this is really important because before we start thinking about what we need in college, I think that we are our best experts, right? We know what our challenges are, both academically and in the world generally, right? So an example for myself being dyslexic, the obvious one is reading. So decoding is really hard for me. Decoding traditional print-based text is difficult for me. I read on about a fourth grade level, but that's not including fluency. And for me, that means that I can identify certain words that a fourth grader can, but not enough to get through an entire fourth grade passage. So that's really huge when thinking about, okay, how am I going to navigate college, right? Um, I also struggle with writing and not coming up with the ideas like some of my peers did, but the actual encoding, the actual spelling part is really difficult for me. And because I utilize all of these accommodations, the other thing I think that people often forget about is timing. It takes me longer with all of my accommodations to complete a written task. But my strengths, I am a really strong uh, verbal person. I love hands-on activities. I'm great when it comes to group projects. I have high-level thinking skills. I can really think and analyze. I have a big vocabulary. And so understanding what my strengths are and my weaknesses, I can begin to think about, so what is it that I need? And for many students in their transition to college, they may already have a sense of that because they received accommodations in high school or middle school or elementary school. And so some of those things are default and you'll know, well, I'm definitely going to need that. And that'll definitely carry through. But then there are other things that you may not automatically think of. So I suggest thinking about, what do you think will be asked of you in college, right? So you're going to have to read material, sometimes more material than you experienced in high school. And that material may be required to be digested at a quicker pace, right? So you'll get an assignment, and the next time the class meets, you'll have to have read it and maybe respond, right? So for someone like me who's dyslexic, if I have difficulty with reading, to me that would translate to, okay, what's going to bridge that gap? And for me, it's text to speech. I can read material on my intellectual level if I have text to speech. Now, what programs am I using? What programs do I use before college, or did I use before college, right? When I was in school, I relied on people a lot. That was the way things were done, right? My teachers would read to me, my parents might read to me, my parents might spell check my work, right? And so sometimes when I meet with families or with students, they'll say, oh, well, I don't really get a lot of accommodations in high school, or I wasn't necessarily in a self-contained special ed class. But as we begin to kind of break down what they're utilizing, we realize that there may be informal accommodations that you may want to transfer, right? So that leads to our next slide. Oops, sorry. Okay. Our next skill that I think is important to know is learning about your accommodations and how they may be translated in college. So what supports work for you? As I mentioned before, sometimes students or parents feel like, well, I don't know, we didn't really get accommodations, that many accommodations. I know maybe I have testing accommodations, so double time, or a smaller environment, or a room by myself, right? And those are things you can definitely ask for in college. But sometimes there may be informal accommodations that you received. So what do I mean by that? Well, I've spoken to a number of families who will say, well, my child doesn't really get double time, or, maybe it's time and a half, but they get to come up at lunch and finish their exam. Well, that's an informal accommodation, right? And so in college, we'll know that we need to ask for more time. Maybe you don't necessarily work with someone in high school to spell check all your work, but you give it to your parents before you turn it in. Well, for most of us, our parents aren't going to be there in a college experience. So thinking about what you would need, that may translate to working with someone that helps you spell check all of your work before it goes out. If you have ADD and have difficulty with executive functioning, you might want to work with somebody who can help you stay on top of what to do in every class and how many classes should I be taking at a time, right? So those are some ways we can think about what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, what do we need, and then how does that transfer to the accommodations we ask for in college. Now, some colleges may openly offer a list of accommodations they routinely offer to students at their college or university. For other colleges, they may not have a list per se, but it is definitely worth Googling. A lot of the accommodations are common. Some of them you may see that you utilize, and others you may have never thought about. So I would definitely suggest before the transition to Google, to ask, to research. It's okay if you haven't figured out every single accommodation you need to be successful, but knowing what it is that you do now that helps you and makes you successful is key to asking for those things in college. So that leads to, okay, asking for things in college, right? Understanding your rights in college as a student with a disability is really important. And for students with disabilities in college, there are laws that protect you and give you rights, right? Like the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act often provide the right to accommodations and modification, and the right to not be discriminated against. And so it's not really important exactly what the law is and what it says, but more that we all know that we have the right to access the classroom and the curriculum and the dorms and the housing and the things that go along with the college experience. So there are accommodations, for instance, that you may get in a testing environment. So double time, as we mentioned, a separate location, a reader, a scribe, extra breaks, the ability to use food to maybe break your test down over a period of days. You may get classroom accommodations. So the ability to use your computer, to use text to speech or speech to text, maybe in a classroom that doesn't allow a computer. That is an accommodation. Your textbooks in a different format, whether it is digitally from the publisher, whether you have a disability needing braille or larger print. You may have, like I did, an accommodation to when you're called on in class, the professor doesn't require you to read verbatim from the textbook, right? That's a huge one. To receive notes either from a peer note taker or to use assistive technology to aid in you taking notes. And it may be that you need accommodations to physically access the building, or when it comes to dorms and living arrangements, whether that has to do with social emotional needs of dorming and resident life, or anything kind of navigating that. It might be a modification, so a change to how things are normally done, right? So for instance, I had a class in undergrad where the exam was to be written or typed. And so a modification for me was the ability to speak my answer, right? And so I say this to say you don't have to have it all figured out, but knowing that there are many different ways to access college and college life and college content, that is half the battle. And so keeping that in the back of your mind when you're applying to colleges and when you're in college is super important. So that leads to getting to know what supports and services are provided at your college or the college you're thinking about attending. So every college, for the most part, has some level of support because of those laws that we talked about that protect students with disabilities. But the range of the types of supports differ greatly depending on the institution. And though the terms may change, right? So I put some general terms down of what some of these programs are called. Some programs call themselves support services, or disability programs, or specialized programs, or colleges and universities. And this could be a whole presentation in of itself, but I really wanted to touch on it, and kind of go through each of them. So I like to say that there are three broad categories or three broad tiers. And I think at a base level, a school will have some version of support services. And that's usually in a general ed college. And the support service center helps with, I would say, minimal accommodations. So basic testing accommodations, mobility accommodations, maybe dorm matching, making sure that you have maybe books in alternative format. And maybe they might assign you a counselor that kind of checks in now and then, but they don't have a deep program designed for students with disabilities. Then I would say the second tier would be some type of disability program or center. Now that could be in a general education college, and they do all of the things that the support service, as I mentioned before, does, but they may have more in-depth services. So you may meet with a counselor, not just, you know, once a semester to kind of touch base, but you might meet with a counselor once a week or twice a week to do what you need as a student with a disability. So for example, I was part of the learning disability program or center at Adelphi. I know they renamed themselves. But I met with someone twice a week, and this person scribed everything for me. At the time, I didn't rely as much on assistive technology and speech to text because honestly, it just wasn't there in 2009 the way it is now. And so this person helped me scribe. They were able to help me pick my classes and tell me what professors were better in terms of disability. They did all of the basic stuff as well. I had friends who would meet with counselors and they had ADD and they would help with tasks involving executive functioning. So definitely helping them pick their classes and what assignments are due and organizing and, well, what do you think you need to do in order to get that done? And, I'm going to check in with you at a certain amount of time to make sure that is done. We also met with a social worker. And so when we talk about, being the liaison or figuring out if, I need to self-advocate or something's not happening or any of the other stress that come with with going to college, we met with someone once a week as a social worker. Then I would say the third tier would be a specialized college or a specialized program within a college, right? And so that may look different depending on the school. One model is a school solely for students with disabilities, right? That's one. The other one could be a program within a college or a university that does all of the things that Disability Center has that I spoke about, all the things that the Support Services Center does, but they also have some classes that are just taught with students with disabilities. They may have a whole first year kind of curriculum that matches classes. And so you are having a specialized program that was designed with students with disabilities in mind. Those are your peers. The professors who are teaching you know how to teach to students with disabilities. And at no matter what program you go to, I think the big thing to keep in mind is, do they have different criteria? And so what do I mean by this? So sometimes disability programs or centers or specialized colleges or universities may have their own admissions process. And or work with admissions to review applications. So if you are someone like me who is not a strong test taker, oftentimes not because I didn't know the material, but because I do have accommodations that mean that like I get double time. And if anybody out there knows, that alone is a very draining process, right? And it affects how I do on standardized testing with all of my accommodations. And so I applied to schools that had programs, many of which either worked with admissions to look at my SAT scores and see beyond that and say, well, okay, yes, but this is a student that has X, and let's look at, her portfolio wider than just her SAT scores and her grade in high school. The learning disability program at Adelphi at the time also had its own separate admissions process that had the ability to override the general admissions process, meaning if you got accepted through that program, you got accepted to the university, whether the university would say you met their criteria of SAT score or whatever. So it's important to ask, when you're applying to a school, not just what their general admissions process is, but also, is there a different process for getting into their program through disability supports? So that's a big thing to keep in mind. That leads me to my next tip. Choose a college where you can see yourself excelling. This is huge. I think, one of the things I learned over time is that for many professions, unless you're like, I don't know, going to like the top school in, the nation, it is, I think the world is less likely to view where you go than where you view where you choose to go. And so it's important that you do well. For many of us, we go to college to graduate. So make sure you can do that. And that means academically, do they have the support you need? For me, I knew because of my level of dyslexia and coming from a self-contained 12 to 1-to-1 school for children with language-based learning disabilities, I couldn't go to a school that just had disability support services. I would need at least the second or third tier of support. And so even though there were schools I desired to go to, I ultimately went to the school that had a reputation for disability and a disability program. I knew I would need that extra level of support. But it could also be beyond academics. It could be where do you want to go geographically? Do you want to be close to home or not? Is your support system at home? For me, even though I got accommodations, I still had to informally accommodate myself and rely on friends and family to help me through the process. So going somewhere that wasn't terribly far from home, well, that was important to me. Is it that your goal is to have social connections, right? I think there's many factors that go into what school is right for you. But what I would say is to tour the school, tour schools when they're in session. I mean, now we live in the time of COVID, so I'm just going to imagine that we can visit people and we can see a normal campus experience. But tour schools, and if you cannot tour schools, at the very least engage with the school, and not just general admissions, but for students with disabilities, I think it's really important to engage with whatever learning disability services, programs, center, college that you plan on utilizing. Talk to them at the admissions process. If you're going to tour a school, set up a tour with them as well. Ask them, are the accommodations that I receive or want to receive or anticipate receiving, do you offer them to current students now? So it was really big for me to find out, like, I use books on tape. I, at the time, used Learning Ally. Do you have that? Are you used to that? Do you know what I'm talking about? And I was surprised in undergrad, and of course, even more so in law school, the schools who would say, oh, we're so excited to have you, but how do you plan on doing this? And this was the Disability Support Center. And I thought to myself, there's no way I can go to a school that has no idea how to serve me, but they're willing to figure it out. Well, that doesn't really work in college, because the first day you get there, you are expected to perform. You might even have homework due on the first day. So while the department is figuring out who they need to reach out to at the publisher to get your book digitally, you're already behind. And I would say that college isn't the time to be a guinea pig for an institution. Of course, it is your call, but I would suggest that you run. The other thing is, you can ask to speak to students who participate in their program. And some schools may say, we can't provide that information, but some schools may say, we'll get back to you, reach out to a student that they think has similar needs and interests as you, and ask them and say, and I volunteered to do that at Syracuse College of Law, right? I said, if students have a learning disability, if they have an interest in disability, if they were a non-traditional student, then please feel free to connect us. And the school did that for me. When I reached out to Syracuse, they put me in contact with a student who also had dyslexia, not nearly as severe as I did. But I got to ask them all the questions. How do you do this? What about this assignment? How do you do writing assignments? What does that look like? And so if you have the opportunity, I would definitely say take advantage of that for sure. That leads to our next skill, learning how to self-advocate, and get what you need, being able to seek help and find your go-to person. So oftentimes I know it is the in thing, and for a while now in the disability community, you hear you have to self-advocate. We're going to teach our students and our children how to self-advocate. And I think it's almost like the word networking. Everybody talks about it and nobody knows what it is or how to do it, right? And I think all of the skills that we've spoken about thus far give you the tools to self-advocate. If you can understand who you are on some level, it doesn't have to be deep, right? But if you understand your strengths, your weaknesses, what you need, if you have some idea of that and can articulate that, then you can self-advocate, right? And so I don't think it has to be the stressful thing, right? The next thing to think about when you're talking about, okay, so I know what I want, I know what I need, I know my strengths, I know my weaknesses. There's many different ways to advocate and self-advocate and get what you need to be successful. So that could be figuring out who in your disability support center, once you get to college, who's the right person to talk to. Maybe it's your counselor there, maybe it's a professor, maybe it's the head of the department, maybe it's a peer mentor, right? So connecting with people and that you think can kind of help you navigate the process is super important. It's okay though to not necessarily know exactly what you want, right? Like sometimes it's hard to know what you don't know, right? And I say over and over again, I've been dyslexic my whole life, diagnosed at 8 years old, but I didn't go to college until I did it. I didn't go to law school until I did it. I wasn't an attorney until I was an attorney. So I didn't know what I was going to need exactly to be a dyslexic attorney. And even though people ask me all the time, right? Even some of the colleges I went to, oh, how do you plan on doing this? I didn't have an answer because I hadn't gone through it yet. And so I think that that is fair and that is okay too. If you can articulate though that you need something or something's not working or you feel like, you're not sure, that's okay too sometimes, right? And that leads to my next skill, is knowing how to problem solve, right? Learning to think outside of the box and really be creative with how you are going to be successful in college. So as I mentioned, it's okay to not know what exactly you need. And the best example I can give is, recent example is when I was in law school and I started and it was my first semester, I went to someone at the law school who did disability kind of at the law school, but not for the general school. And she had worked with me in orientation, so I was familiar with her. And I said, something's not clicking. Like, I feel like I'm just not synthesizing information. Like, I'm not absorbing the information. And I wasn't sure if I didn't know it because I was a first year law student and nobody knows the information, or whether this had to do with my disability. And I think oftentimes, especially for students with disabilities, we are quick to think that it's us, and us in a bad way. Like, maybe people are right. I can't do law school. Maybe you can't be dyslexic or not know how to read and be a lawyer, right? Like, those definitely flew around in my mind. But I said, no, I'm going to speak to somebody. I'm going to, maybe, and at least if it's me, I'll find out it's me. So I spoke to her and she said, oh, no, everybody has difficulties. And I said, no, it's not that I'm having difficulty. I can't even get to difficulty because I feel like I read the information, I go to school, but it's just not clicking. And, I saw the look in her face and she kind of sighed and she kind of let me in on a secret. And she said, well, in law school, we ask people to do outlines, which is a very print-based way of learning. You're supposed to type and you're supposed to shrink your outline and get smaller and smaller. And I guess by osmosis, you learn the information. I don't know because I can't do it. And she said, maybe that's why you're not getting the information. And I said, that makes total sense. I didn't know what they were saying to outline. I can't do that. I tried, it doesn't work. And then she said, well, I'm not sure if I should say this, which she could. There was, no, she didn't out the student, so she could have absolutely said it. But I guess for stigma, she was hesitant. And she said, well, there's a blind student and he works with like a student aid that helps him study. And I'm not really sure what they do, but I know that they don't outline. And I said, oh, that could work. Because though I'm not blind, I too have a print-based disability. So I asked her, I said, well, how do I get one of those? And she said, well, we don't have the funding in our department to do it. And I said, but if I go to disability services, they would, and ask for it as an accommodation, they'd pay for it, right? And she said, oh, yeah, absolutely. So then I went from her to disability services and I explained what was going on and what I needed. And I know there's other students with print-based disability. And long and behold, now I was working with an aide, a student aide for every single one of my classes from then to the time I graduated law school. So that is an example of how to think outside of the box, how to self-advocate for yourself in that it could either be, I know I need this accommodation, which I've had to do before, professors who have said, you can't record my class. Well, I know I need recordings, but it could also be, I'm not sure, I'm not getting the information, and there may be a creative solution, right? So definitely don't be afraid to think outside of the box when you are navigating your college process. That leads to my last tip before moving on to questions. And that is, when you are a student with a disability, with a learning disability, with dyslexia, and you are navigating the college experience, you have to be resilient. Success is often achieved from failure. That is a saying I definitely, live by. And I would say you can never give up. I think that there's no right way to do college, for sure. And just because a major or a college or a program doesn't work for you, it doesn't necessarily mean that college doesn't work for you. And I think that we often inflate the two. And so what do I mean by that? Well, for one, I learned that no one in college has it figured out. That is an illusion. But then, so even in my own experience, I was denied my right to take the LSAT, which is the admissions exam for law school with accommodations I had gotten since I was 8 years old. I ended up working in between, but I refiled and I hired an attorney and I ended up in law school. I started in undergrad. I started as a political science major. I switched to sociology because they had more essays. And though I couldn't spell, I knew that I needed more ways to show what I knew other than exam at the end of the semester. I looked at schools who said absurd things like, I thought you'd have a seeing eye dog, or we don't know how to accommodate you, or getting to an institution, getting to a law school and them not providing my accommodations, which is what happened to me. And I had to withdraw from that law school. I ended up, filing a complaint with the Federal Department of Education, but then attending Syracuse College of Law, where I had to self-advocate a lot there. But I graduated, and I graduated magna cum laude. And so my biggest takeaway from that is, in one instance, I was a law school dropout. I could not do law school. And then I realized it wasn't that I couldn't do law school. I couldn't do law school there in that program, but I did law school, and I did it pretty well to graduate top of my class at Syracuse. So there's just so many different ways that college can work. I know people who transfer. I know people who start in more supportive programs and graduate in programs with less support because they don't need it. I know people who have done the reverse. They get to a program and it doesn't have enough support. People who switch majors. I just really want the biggest takeaway for this to be, your dream is bigger than what you anticipate it should look like on the outset. You might think this is what I have to go to college. Maybe. And I have to go to this college. Maybe, maybe not. I have to study this thing. Maybe, maybe not. And I have to do it now. Maybe, maybe not. There's so many different ways to navigate this college process, and that you or your child or the students you work with will grow throughout the process. And what your needs are, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, those will change too. So be resilient and never give up, because the college process is definitely doable for students with disabilities. It's just how you're going to do that. And that's so individualized to each student. So I know that I have spoken a lot, and I really want to give time for questions and answers, whether that's to clarify anything I've said, or if you thought of anything while I was speaking, or even came with questions ahead of time, that's okay too. I'd love to hear. I'm not monitoring the Q&A because I can't read. I'll stop sharing my screen, but then I'll ask if you could read what's in the Q&A, and we'll do some of that.
Yes, for sure. Thank you. That was amazing. So here's a question. If a student goes to a private high school, is the public school district still responsible for administrating the testing needed for a 504 plan for college?
So, okay, that's a very loaded question. So I think what the question is asking is, I'm assuming it's the SAT or the ACT or the exam that's needed for college. And if that is the case, right, I see heads.
I
No.
know, I think it was the question is more if the district is responsible for testing to see if they need a 504 plan for college.
Okay, so, okay, that's
Yeah.
also dense. Okay, so when you graduate, so K-12, you have a 504 or you have an IEP. But once you graduate, that moves in, your IEP or 504 doesn't necessarily move with you to college. So the accommodations that you receive, through either a 504 or an IEP, some of them are accommodations you can ask for in college, but your IEP doesn't transfer with you. So I hope that kind of clarifies that. So there won't be an assessment to kind of like have a final meeting to talk about a 504 that will then carry with you to college. Another question?
Well, we have a comment, and she says, I'm super impressed by your grit and tenacity. The question is, did you take a full load of classes? What happens if your request for an accommodation is denied?
Well, thank you, first and foremost. That is a great question. So I'll answer it in two sections. So in undergrad, I did take a full load, but I worked really hard with my learning disability program to find out what professors I should be taking and when. That was crucial. And two, even though I took a full load, which I believe was like 3 credits, which is like 4 classes, I took 3 classes that were academic, so to speak. And I always made sure, I don't know how I pulled it off, but every semester I did an elective. I did pottery, I did dance, I did photography, I did square dancing. Okay. And I'm from New York City. So there's nothing wrong with square dancing. It's just not something we traditionally do. I took some type of elective that I wouldn't have a final at the end of the semester, and that I could use my other skills. I'm a very tactile person. I use multisensory education. In terms of learning how to read, I knew that a hands-on class where I would not be graded at the end by a final is what I would need. So even though I took 4 classes, I only had 3 finals. And then of those, I tried to balance my course load with ones that were writing heavy versus reading heavy. And because I was part of a learning disability program, I was really able to ask those questions, and they had experience with like, don't take that professor, or even though Sociology 201 is offered in the fall, it's offered in the spring by this professor, and they do the syllabus completely different. It's a lot more projects, right? And so I did take a full-time course load, but I would say that I finessed it in a way that made it manageable for me, and that's key. But by the time I got to law school, on the other hand, it is really reading and writing heavy. There is no square dancing, and it takes me twice as long to get through written material. I knew that. And so I was a part-time student in law school, but I treated it as a full-time course load. So for many of them, and I also went to a school where the part-time students were mixed in with the full-time students, which isn't always the norm in law school. It is in undergrad for most undergrad programs, but not necessarily law school. And so I was mixed in, but I think more than that, because I was in the library so much, because I was studying and reading and doing all these things that, would have taken up time of an extra course or 2 or 3, many students didn't even realize I was part-time, even though I was very vocal about it. So people kind of knew, because I'm open about my disability and what my needs are. And I felt if more people knew, there'd be less stigma, yada, yada, yada. But I took a part-time course load with a full-time intention and a full-time commitment. It also meant that now I talked about having these aides that I worked with for every class. So even though I took, I think, part-time in law school is a little bit more. I think I took 3 or 4 classes. I had an aide for each of them. So that doubled the amount of time that I had to spend in a one-to-one environment for that one, for each class, it was double. And then I had to go home and study. So I did not on paper take a full-time course load, but I definitely treated it like a full-time program. The last part of the question is, what do you do when you don't get accommodations? That is very tricky, or has multiple answers. Let me put it that way. So I think the first step is what we talked about in terms of self-advocacy. So figuring out what the channels are, who is it that you request accommodations for? What is the procedure like? Does my school have a grievance process? So that maybe if the professor says no, well, yeah, this is really a decision that's made by disability services. I'm going to go to them. If that doesn't happen, is there an ADA coordinator or supervisor or grievance process at my school? And then, of course, because for most students with disabilities are protected by federal law, there are many avenues after that. That could be reaching out to the Federal Department of Education and doing their OCR process. It could mean speaking to an attorney or an advocate and trying to figure out, what your course of action is. It really depends on what the accommodation is, what the situation is, as to how you should navigate the situation. So I guess I'll leave it at that without getting into too much detail, because it really is fact specific.
So here's a question. Please clarify if an IEP and or a 504 travels with you to college.
So no. So you're entitled to free and appropriate education until you are 21. But when you graduate or age out of K-12, so to speak, your IEP ends, right? Because it doesn't cover adults. Similarly to a 504 plan, so there's the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, but that is different than your actual 504 plan that is on file with your K through 12 school, right? But I will say that for many programs, they want to see your history of disability and accommodation. So even though they're not going to carry out your IEP or 504 because you're an adult now and you're protected under these different laws, they may look and many of them will ask to see an IEP or a 504 and figure out what accommodations did you receive in high school? Are these just new accommodations or are they consistent accommodations? Can we start from this point? So they may ask for that. Same thing with testing agencies, right? So for the GREs or, the LSAT or the MCAT or any of those, they might also ask the same way that the SAT or the ACT might have asked. So no, it doesn't carry, right? But it can be used to support your need for accommodation in college. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think so.
It could be tricky.
Yeah, I know, and there's a lot of people, it can get confusing. But here's a follow-up about the required testing. So the question is, colleges required updated testing usually within 3 years, but the more recent, the better.
Yes.
So these EduPsych or neuropsychs tests are very expensive to obtain privately. My question is a legal one. Is the public school district within which the student resides obligated to do the testing needed for those, or to document the disability? I guess that's the one question. And I would ask, what testing did you use to get the accommodations in your college and law school? And
Yes.
Okay, so when and who were you tested during your academic career?
Okay, that too is a loaded question, but a very good one. So yes, usually the rule of thumb is most agencies, testing companies in college will ask for documentation within the last 3 years. And then after you turn 21, within the last 5 years, usually. That's, a common rule of thumb, right? And you're right, it can be expensive. I think, geographically and from state to state, it varies. I am in New York, and I know that there are places that do sliding scale. Sometimes colleges, maybe not the college you're applying to, but a local college may do a sliding scale program where students in their psych program will learn. And so they'll do a psychoeducational evaluation at a sliding scale rate, or some of at least in New York, some of our hospitals may do that because they may have a program within it. I think one of the ways to also finesse, so to speak, is while your child is in high school, right? They are entitled to some level of a reevaluation, right? And so without getting super technical about how much of it do they have to perform, one of the things you can ask for is an updated evaluation, possibly while your child is in high school, maybe a junior or in their junior year or senior year, to prepare for college in 2 years. So that's one way that you can receive an evaluation for college. Also, even though your IEP and 504 do not physically travel with you, and they will not work off of that, can also be used for proof that this is accommodation you received and that you were entitled to. Different schools are flexible on what it is that they require. Right. And so I would definitely check out, if you have a specific school in mind, what they would want and what they would need. And with that, so if you do end up going with a private evaluator, which is something that I've had to do, especially as I've gotten older and my needs have gotten more nuanced, or if you're going to go with a sliding scale, or if you're going to go with your school district paying for it, oftentimes it's helpful to call the institution or the testing agency and say, what exactly do you need? So some require the Woodcock Johnson or the WACE for, you know, students with print-based disabilities. Sometimes they want to see what your ability is like timed and untimed. Some schools will say, you know, well, this child's had dyslexia since they were 8. Their documentation is technically, their eval's 4 years old, but they have every IEP and every 504. So I would suggest that if you can, absolutely get reevaluated. If you're going to get reevaluated and you have schools in mind, ask them what their requirements are for their documentation, because some just say an updated eval, but they are looking for specific things, and it's just easier if you ask.
All right, lost track up here. Sorry. My cursor's not working. All right, I think I might have missed one, but because it's hopping around here. But here's another question. Excellent presentation, very impressive. Would you consider giving a presentation for a Girl Scout troop? We have a couple of girls with language-based disabilities. You are a wonderful role model, and it's very much needed.
Oh, I would love to. I mean, I'd love to know more about it, like when, where, I don't want to overcommit, but absolutely. I mean, for me, I know growing up, I didn't have examples of what someone with dyslexia looked like. Whether they went to college or not, I didn't know of anyone who had it. And when I began to learn of these icons that we often tout in the community, they didn't look like me. And so I'm really, really big on being able to provide that for students, but also turnkey information. I mean, I always felt like, and my family always felt like, we were reinventing the wheel, even though we knew the statistics on dyslexia. Like, you know, where are these up to, 20% and, whatever, depending on the metric you use, how many dyslexics there are. And I would say, where are these people? I would have to reinvent the wheel. And as much as, I could share not only my experience, what I've learned professionally and personally, so that families don't have to do that and students don't have to do that, I would love to. I don't know. I think we'll be posting later, not only this presentation, but a tips and tricks guide. So maybe if you could email, we could share my email as well. And I'd love to learn more about the Girl Scouts. That sounds awesome.
So here's another one. Thanks for sharing your valuable experience that we can learn from. You're an inspiration and gives me hope from my son who has ADHD. Are there colleges in different countries that would be more accommodating to students with disabilities, or is US the most accommodating?
You guys have some really great questions tonight. Formally, I don't have a formal answer for that. I am unaware of particular institutions internationally that would be a great fit. I know that it really varies country by country. It is a really weird space in that a lot of countries have signed the CRPD, and so in a lot of ways they are ahead of the US, but we are, unique in a lot of ways in terms of the teeth that the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act provide for people with disabilities. And so my personal experience traveling or studying abroad is that not many countries have some of the same level of support. I mean, this is my personal experience, which is why I'm not giving like a formal recommendation. And so I'm not really sure. I would definitely, it doesn't hurt to research it. I don't know of any. I don't know of anybody that knows of any. I've heard more stories of people not necessarily getting accommodations abroad and then coming here and saying, oh, wow, because of the laws we have. But, that's my informal opinion or analysis.
So is there a list of colleges, universities where accommodations and support services are offered for students with disabilities?
Yeah, so there's a couple of them. I mean, I'm old school, but when I started graduating, I'm not that old, but when I graduated, there was a book, and I know that gets updated. I know there are different organizations that have it on their website. It is more common now, so it is something that you could even Google. I keep my own that I usually give out to families that I work with. The only thing I would caution is that because there is such a huge spectrum of what it means to have services for students with disabilities at college, I have not found anything that really goes into depth about, this school has support services, and this, it may say that it's a school for children. It may say that these are recommended schools, but depending on your disability and need for support, right? I have had friends and worked with families who went to a certain college or university, and they might not have had the level of support on paper, but they went above compliance, and vice versa. So I would encourage you, even when you do find a list through Google, or purchasing the book or whatever, that you also do a little bit more deep diving and think about some of the questions we talked about today.
Just to
All right.
interject, we have a book
Yeah.
that I can post the title of to the page, once we get everything up on the website. And I also agree with you, Ptahra, there's nothing that you absolutely have to go and visit the school, even with what's described in the books. There's nothing that matches actually going and visiting and sitting down with people. And I loved your suggestion about meeting with students who are like you, who go to the school too. I think that's a really great tip.
We have a few more questions. Well done with your accomplishments. Also super impressed. If a student is still struggling with workload due to dyslexia and ADHD, even by junior year of high school using an IEP, is it likely for them to be able to carry a full course load and finish college in 4 years?
Wow. I'm going to answer this in parts too, because I think it'll be easier to break down. So it's so hard, because as much as I want to just give an answer, I've worked and spoke with and know so many different students with disabilities and learning disabilities, and it is so fact specific. So struggling in a school could look very different. So for instance, if you're struggling in a mainstream program with services, that may be very different than struggling in a self-contained special ed environment. That being said, college is so different because it depends on what you were studying, for sure. I've had friends who struggled in special ed, self-contained environment with tons of resources, and they went to college and they studied art. And they are very successful. And their dyslexia, yeah, I mean, they struggled through art history, but it was very different. Then I know, okay, so maybe it's part of what you study. It's also where you go to school. I know that I've worked with and spoken with students who struggled in their school, in their town, in their district, in their zone school, with what they thought were the accommodations. I got all the accommodations, and you grow to learn you didn't have all the accommodations, or you had accommodations for what your town offered, and now you decided to go to a college designed for students with disabilities, and you're excelling. And so that question is just so hard to answer, because unless I really know the student and what their desires are and how they're struggling. I sometimes hear from students and families that they're struggling, and they're struggling in certain content areas. Well, 9 times out of 10, you're not going to go to college for the area you're struggling. Like I did not become a doctor. I cannot do science, and I could not do math, right? I leaned on the things that I was good at, and beyond that, we choose to go to institutions that work for us. In terms of how many years you graduate, that is also such a very difficult question, because I mean, certain schools are on, 2 semesters versus 3 semesters. Certain, I was a part-time student, but I graduated instead of 4 years in 3.5, and I technically only did 3.5 because I had one professor that didn't give me accommodations. And I did that because I took summer courses. So I just think there's so many different, I mean, I studied abroad. And this is a little off tangent, but if we're undergrad, I was not getting what was anthropology. I found a dance program in Ghana, okay? Because I thought I want to study abroad, but like I can't learn another language in another country. Like they don't have the ADA. Like how am I going to do this? I found a dance and cultural program that I, wrote to my school about and said, oh, I think this is anthropology. I'm going to learn about dyads and triads and how people get along. And I don't know how they bought it, but I took this program through UMass Amherst and I got 6 credits of dance that I transferred in. I mean, I know people who spend whole semesters in Italy and they eat food, I mean, it's just so different based on what you choose to do, what type of student and learner you are, to say. But I also want to say that it's okay if you do not finish in 4 or 5 years. That is a reality. I have friends and know people and worked with people who took a very long time to graduate. And I don't think I would have been able to do it. I think I would have given up. I would have said, I'm too old or whatever. I want to, have a job, whatever. And they stuck through it. And so college looks different for everybody. And if it takes 3 years or 4 years, great. If it takes 5 or 6, that's okay too. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but you guys are giving loaded questions tonight. So I want to be able to address them.
So here's another question. When do you suggest the student's disability is disclosed? During the application process or after acceptance into a school?
That is also a good question. I think that decision is very personal to each individual. It also depends on the circumstance. And so, like I mentioned, there are some schools that have a separate admissions process that you can go through. And if you are going to apply to a disability program, you have to disclose you have one. And so therefore, you would then disclose in your general application because then that wouldn't make sense, right? I mean, and so for some, it may be that they disclose right away. I've always been open about my disability. I mean, even now, like, in terms of jobs, I mean, you could Google me, so I say it. And also how you disclose can be done differently. So it could be checking a box. It could also be in your admissions essay. Some schools have diversity essays. That's a great place to disclose your disability, how it has made you, all of these qualities we talked about, like being resilient and tenacious and all of these things, and that that college will be different and difficult, but that you could do it. So that's one way to disclose. It could be checking the box. And for some, they do not disclose, and that is within your right until they get to school. I will say that if you are looking to get accommodations and a fear of discrimination or any of that, you have to disclose it, right? Like an institution doesn't have are not required to just provide these things, unfortunately. And so if you don't disclose, you won't get them. And, or you can't say they're discriminating if they don't know. So, for many students, it's at least once they're admitted to the program that you should disclose, that you should, find that resource center, that, like we said, there's going to be documentation, all of these things that they need. So for many of us, the process starts a lot earlier. And so it really depends on what is best for the student, what you feel is best for you, but there's many different ways to disclose. I personally think the sooner the better. There is nothing worse than getting into a program and they can't accommodate you. I mean, I understand the fear of just, discrimination and not accepting me because, and like, that is all very real. But I've been in a situation where you get to the place and I just really wish they didn't accept me. I mean, if you didn't have it, I told you. So it varies. But in my opinion, as soon as possible.
All right, so we have a follow-up question about the testing. She really wanted to know, is the public school legally required to do the testing even if the student is enrolled in the private school? This is going back to the question about the educational psych going like a year before they go, or the testing that was required for college.
So, I mean, I think we're moving into the specifics that it borders legal advice, and it really depends on your state and your district. And so I am not familiar with Connecticut, so I don't want to speak on that. If it is under the guidelines of FAPE, this is where it gets gray. The answer could be yes, but I think it would depend on the circumstances and the idea. I mean, in this case, you wouldn't be asking for them to evaluate the student for college, right? You're asking them to evaluate the student now, and you're going to use that evaluation in college. So I don't know if anybody else on the call wants to say something more specific to your state.
Yeah, if she wants to email us at SpedNet Wilton, we can try to talk to her and see what's going on there. That's fine.
That's good.
Okay, so we have one more in the chat or in the Q&A. What were the undergrad and grad schools you had on your list that you felt were accommodating? And can you remind me where you went?
Yes. So I went to Adelphi University for undergrad, and I went to Syracuse for law school. I think there are quite a few schools. I think there are more undergraduate programs that are supportive of students with disabilities. I found it atrocious on the law school level. And so I won't even touch that with a 10-foot pole. And I think for most families, we are talking about undergrad, so I'm safe to start there. I think there are a couple of schools that come to mind just off the top of my head. I would suggest, though, the list is pretty long. I mainly focus on East Coast schools because that's, where I hail from. But I think, when you're talking about the most supportive or a school for children with disabilities, of course, Landmark comes to mind. When you talk about a school that maybe has that, it's not necessarily a school for students with disabilities, but like Mitchell has a program where you are with your own cohort for an entire year, where a number of your courses are just taught with students with disabilities, and therefore by professors who know. When you talk about your second tier of support, I think of, and these are, mainly East Coast schools, but I think of Marist, I think of Adelphi, I think of Long Island Post. When I think of the least amount of support, I think of Syracuse when you talk about learning disabilities. I would not have been able to go there as an undergrad student. When I got there in law school, I was able to advocate for the things that I knew I needed from undergrad. And so that's how I got the aid. And, I met with someone a consultant, that they paid externally to spell check with me. I don't think I would have been able to do that on my own as an undergraduate. And so I'm glad I didn't make the choice to attend that school as an undergrad student. But it also really is specific to my disability, right? They have other programs that are great, for different disabilities. I think of, what is it? Florida Atlantic or something. They have a similar type of support. Then I think of other schools that just have like one person in their office. Unfortunately, a lot of our, at least in New York, a lot of our CUNY and SUNY schools don't have the infrastructure. So I remember taking classes over the summer and thinking I'd transfer them back because that's what students do. They go back home, they take, a class at their community college and transfer them in. And I remember it being one person in their office. They denied me every accommodation. And when I went to meet with them, like, what do you mean? Like, I go to Adelphi. This is what I get. Like, I understand I'm not going to meet with someone once a week, but I'm taking like an intro level, whatever course. My parents can help me spell check. It's fine. And they said, they had a huge stack of folders, and they said, these are all the people we denied this semester. If you're going to use a computer, it'd be my computer. I'm the only one that works here. There, and whether or not that's right, whether or not that's legal, it was the fact. And so there are some schools that, if you need extra time, fine. But other than that, I can't really figure, if you need to make sure your class is in an area you could physically access as wheelchair user, fine, but I can't really provide all these things that you're asking me for. And so there's a number of those schools as well. And without singling out institutions, that is not my intention or advocating for one over the other, because again, I really do think it's fact specific as to what each student needs. But those just off the top of my head are examples of schools in my different categories, so to speak.
So just thank you for that answer. That was really good. Just so that everybody knows, next week there's something that ties in very closely to what we're talking about right now. Darien CPAC is having a presentation, Colleges with Support Services. It's a panel discussion. It's on Monday, March 15th from 7 to 8:30. And it's actually posted on our website. So if you want to take a look after, you can jot that down. They have several schools there that will be talking about their disability services.
Awesome.
That's Darien CPAC.
Yeah, so we have one in the chat. Why does school ask about medications? And they want to know what your prescriptions are. Is there,
Yeah, I mean,
isn't there advice to a law you don't need to tell what prescription names, or I guess not have to tell them what they are?
Yes, I would want to know more about the context of that. So, if you were looking for an accommodation, then the rules of the game kind of changes a little bit. Can they generally ask you on an application? Not necessarily, and they can ask, but doesn't mean you always have to tell. But when you're looking for accommodations, a lot of times they will ask you what medications you're on for a number of different reasons. So for example, if you have ADD and you're asking for certain accommodations, they may ask, what kind of medication are you on medication, so that if an incident happens and you didn't take your medication, they can say, well, hey, that can, and not in a negative way, not in a like, well, it's your fault, but like, how do I advocate for that student? What does that student need? If you're going to ask for, breaks during an exam to take your medication, you need to let them know that you're on medication and this is what it is, right? In case something goes, wrong, or in case they have to store it. And so, sometimes a lot of the questions are very general, and, they were on my entry process for a lot of schools. They didn't apply to me because I have dyslexia and I don't have any medication attributed to that. So I just left it blank. But then I have, friends and families I've worked with where the student maybe has ADD or has some kind of health need for which their accommodation is tied to that health need, right? And so it's important for the school to know, what are these parameters, and what happens? What if, I've worked with students and they're on medication, their doctor switches their medication and they had a really tough week. And so now they have to go into the disability services office and ask for accommodations. Can I have a copy of these notes? Can my test be, delayed, whatever, because I didn't, I had difficulty with my medication this week, or, certain students move to another state, and I've seen that happen, and they have difficulty getting their accommodations in the beginning of the semester, the beginning of the year. And so the disability support services are helping to facilitate, whatever happened there. So, I would imagine that those are some of the scenarios that you're college could be asking for. If you feel like that is not the case, and it could very well be, then I advise you to speak to somebody who can, really look at your specific situation, because sometimes it is helpful, and then they are within their right to ask because you want accommodation for it. So I hope that that helps. And I know that I've been lengthy with my answers, but I want it to be helpful. So I hope that that helps.
Yeah, that's great. There's nothing more now, and we've gone a little, and we've lost a few people. So, wow, that was awesome. That was great.
Yeah, Attorney Jeppe, you've been
Yeah.
amazing. Your advice has been tremendous. You're an inspiration. Your answers were wonderful and so helpful. So
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you for having me. It was definitely a pleasure. If more questions come up, feel free to email, and they know how to reach me. And so
Yes.
I'm still available after this session ends. So
Oh,
thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure.
so wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. Really, truly, it was great.
That was awesome.
It's great.
Oh, there's one more. Is there one more?
Oh, there is one more Q&A.
There's one.
Thank you so
She
much.
said thank you. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Okay, so have a
All
good
right. Well, have a good
one.
care,
Take care,
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.